The fog of a London morning in September 1818 wrapped the narrow streets of Bloomsbury in cold silence. The sound of cartwheels and distant voices moved slowly through the mist, as if the city itself had not yet fully awakened. Inside a modest cottage at the edge of the district, Miss Vivienne Carter stood beside her small writing desk. Her hands trembled slightly as she stared at the black wax seal on the envelope before her. The seal bore the crest of her late uncle, Lord Edmund Carter, a falcon in flight. For several moments she simply looked at it. At 28 years old, Vivienne Carter knew exactly what people said about her. Society had long ago decided her fate. Unmarriageable. The whispers had once hurt deeply, but over time they had become dull, familiar sounds that no longer surprised her. Poor thing. Past her prime. What a waste. Such intelligence, but nowhere to place it. Vivienne had learned to live quietly within those judgments. She had convinced herself that solitude was not a punishment, but a choice. Most days, she believed it. Yet some mornings, when the silence of her little cottage pressed too closely around her, doubt crept in like winter cold beneath a door. She finally broke the wax seal. The letter inside was written in the careful hand of a solicitor. Lord Edmund Carter had died. Vivienne read the line twice before it fully settled into her mind. Her uncle had always seemed more legend than family. A distant man who spent decades traveling across Europe studying plants and collecting rare botanical specimens. She had seen him only a handful of times, and yet now, according to the letter, he had left her his entire estate. Vivienne read the words again slowly, hardly believing them. Willowmere Estate in Yorkshire. 150 acres of gardens and woodland. A grand manor house filled with paintings and furniture collected over decades. A library of 2,000 books. £12,000 invested carefully, producing an income of £700 a year. The numbers alone felt unreal. For years, she had lived quietly on a small allowance from distant relatives who barely remembered she existed. Now she stood on the edge of comfort, independence, even power. But as her eyes moved further down the letter, the excitement in her chest slowly tightened into dread. There was a condition. Her uncle's will contained a clause. Vivienne Carter must marry within 6 months of his death. The marriage must occur before March of 1819. And it must be genuine. If she failed to marry, or if the marriage was judged false or convenient, the entire estate would pass instead to her cousin Reginald Montfort. The final line struck even harder. The man responsible for judging whether her marriage was genuine was Lord Sebastian Montgomery, Marquis of York, executor of the will. Vivienne lowered the letter slowly. For several seconds, she simply stared at the wall. Then anger rushed through her like fire. Her uncle had not merely given her freedom. He had chained that freedom to a deadline. For 8 years, she had endured the quiet humiliation of society's pity. She had refused 3 proposals in her early 20s because each man had treated her as a convenient alliance rather than someone worth truly knowing. She had chosen dignity over a loveless marriage. Now she was being pushed back into the marriage market like some desperate debutante racing against time. The thought burned. The knock on her door broke through her thoughts. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Dawson, appeared in the doorway. A widow of 50 with warm eyes and sharp understanding, she had served Vivienne faithfully for years. "There's a gentleman to see you, Miss Carter," she said carefully. "He says his name is Lord York." Vivienne froze. Lord York. Already. "He arrived in a very fine carriage," Mrs. Dawson added. "Shall I send him away or show him in?" Vivienne straightened slowly. If this man controlled the fate of her inheritance, avoiding him would solve nothing. "Show him in," she said. 3 minutes later, Lord Sebastian Montgomery stepped into the small drawing room. Vivienne had expected someone older. Instead, she found a tall man in his early 30s, broad-shouldered and composed, with dark hair touched slightly by silver at the temples. His face carried the sharp lines of aristocratic breeding, but it was his eyes that caught her attention, gray and tired. The eyes of someone who had known grief. "Miss Carter," he said in a low voice, "forgive the sudden visit. I thought it best we speak immediately after you received the letter." Vivienne gestured toward a chair. "Please sit, my lord." They regarded each other quietly as Mrs. Dawson served tea and withdrew. "You must have questions," he said. "Dozens," Vivienne replied calmly. "But perhaps we should begin with why my uncle decided to control my life from beyond the grave." A flicker of amusement touched his expression. "Edmund believed you were wasting your life," Lord York said. The words struck harder than she expected. "He said you chose invisibility because it felt safer than disappointment." Vivienne stiffened. "He had no right to judge me." "No," Lord York said quietly. "But he loved you in his own unusual way." He explained that Edmund Carter had kept every letter Vivienne had ever sent him. 14 letters discussing botany and science. Letters he had shown proudly to his closest friend, Lord York himself. "He believed you possessed a remarkable mind," Sebastian continued, "and that your life deserved more than quiet resignation." Vivienne felt a strange mix of anger and confusion. "And so he forced me toward marriage." "Not toward marriage," Lord York corrected gently. "Toward love." He told her about Edmund's youth. 30 years earlier, Edmund had loved the daughter of a country vicar, but his family had forbidden the match. He obeyed. The woman married someone else. Edmund spent the rest of his life regretting that decision. "He believed fear had stolen his happiness," Sebastian said softly. "He hoped to spare you the same fate." Vivienne sat very still. The anger inside her slowly shifted into something more complicated. Understanding. Outside the window, the London fog began to thin, but the future ahead of her remained uncertain. Somewhere between duty and freedom, between fear and hope, her life had just changed forever, and she had only 6 months to decide what it would become. The weeks after the reading of the will changed Vivienne Carter's life in ways she had never imagined. For years, she had walked through London almost unnoticed. Invitations had been rare. Conversations had been polite, but distant. Most families considered her a clever woman who had simply waited too long. But the moment news of her inheritance spread, everything shifted. Letters began arriving every morning. Invitations to dinners, invitations to balls, invitations to afternoon teas hosted by women who had ignored her existence for years. Vivienne sat one morning at her small breakfast table while Mrs. Dawson sorted through the growing pile of envelopes. 3 dinner invitations, Mrs. Dawson said dryly. 2 musicales, 1 lecture on classical literature, and a gentleman requesting permission to call. Vivienne rubbed her temples. "They smell the money," Mrs. Dawson continued, "like wolves around a fresh kill." "Perhaps some of them are sincere," Vivienne said without conviction. "And perhaps the moon is made of cheese," Mrs. Dawson replied. Within weeks, the first proposal arrived. The gentleman was a widower of 50, with 6 children and a crumbling estate. He spoke kindly about her intelligence and assured her she would make an excellent mother and household manager. Vivienne declined politely. The second proposal came from a younger son with no income, but impressive taste in expensive coats. He praised her beauty and claimed to admire her love of books. Yet when she asked which books he enjoyed most, he could not name a single author. She declined again. By October, she had attended 16 social gatherings and rejected 5 proposals. The experience only strengthened what she had always believed. The marriage market was exhausting. Men smiled at her with calculation in their eyes. Mothers pushed their sons toward her like merchants offering goods for sale. Each conversation carried the same silent question: how quickly will she marry? The pressure of the deadline hung over every interaction. Vivienne began to feel like an object rather than a person. Then, one evening at Lady Helmsworth's autumn ball, something unexpected happened. The ballroom glittered with candlelight, reflecting across marble floors and jeweled gowns. Vivienne stood near the refreshment table with a glass of lemonade, enjoying a brief moment of quiet observation. A voice beside her spoke gently. "I confess, I had not expected to find anyone else hiding here." She turned. The man beside her appeared to be around 30. He had fair hair, bright green eyes, and a warm smile that felt refreshingly genuine. "Philip Waverley," he said with a bow, "solicitor and occasional poet." "Vivienne Carter," she replied. His eyes brightened immediately. "Ah, the famous heiress with the 6-month marriage deadline." Vivienne sighed. "Famous is not the word I would choose. I find the situation rather romantic," he said lightly. "A race against time to find true love." Vivienne laughed despite herself. "Real life is rarely so convenient." "Perhaps," he said, "but sometimes stories surprise us." Their conversation continued easily. Philip Waverley spoke with humor and intelligence. He asked thoughtful questions about literature and science. He listened carefully when she spoke. For the first time in weeks, Vivienne felt she was speaking to someone who saw her as more than a fortune. Then a new voice interrupted. "Miss Carter." Vivienne turned. Lord Sebastian Montgomery stood a few steps away. Tall, composed, his gray eyes unreadable. "Lord York," she said. "I hope I am not interrupting," he said calmly. "Not at all," Waverley replied easily. But Vivienne noticed the slight tension in Sebastian's posture. "Miss Carter," Sebastian said, "may I have the next dance?" The question sounded polite, yet something about it felt almost like a command. Vivienne placed her hand on his arm and allowed him to lead her to the dance floor. The music began as couples arranged themselves for the quadrille. "You do not like Mr. Waverley," she said quietly. "I do not know him well enough to dislike him," Sebastian replied. "That is not an answer." Sebastian hesitated. "I believe caution would be wise." "Why?" "He has had financial difficulties in the past." Vivienne frowned. "Gambling debts," Sebastian said carefully. "Nothing proven, but enough to raise concern." The dance brought them close again. "You think he is pursuing me for my money," Vivienne said. "I think you deserve honesty," Sebastian replied. The music ended. Before she could respond, Sebastian bowed and stepped away, but the look in his eyes stayed with her. Over the following weeks, Philip Waverley began calling regularly. 3 times a week, he brought flowers and books of poetry. They spoke for hours about literature, politics, and science. His company was pleasant, comfortable, yet something inside Vivienne remained uncertain. Meanwhile, Lord York disappeared from social events entirely. He did not attend balls or dinners where she might see him. Instead, he wrote letters. Every week, letters about Willowmere Estate. He asked her opinion on repairs to tenant cottages, on improvements to drainage systems, on the care of rare plants her uncle had collected. The letters treated her not as a temporary beneficiary, but as the future owner. She admired that, but his absence left a strange emptiness. One winter afternoon, Mrs. Dawson approached the window with a curious expression. "You should see this." Vivienne joined her. Across the street sat a black carriage bearing the crest of the York family. It had been there 3 afternoons that week, always at the same hour, always while Mr. Waverley was visiting. "Lord York," Mrs. Dawson said calmly. "Watching." Vivienne stared. "That is absurd." "Is it?" Before she could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Mr. Waverley had arrived. His visit lasted an hour. But Vivienne barely heard half of what he said. Her thoughts kept drifting to the carriage across the street. When he finally left, she made a sudden decision. She wrapped herself in a cloak and crossed the road. The footman opened the carriage door in surprise. Lord York sat inside. His expression shifted from shock to concern as she climbed in. "Miss Carter, why are you here?" she asked directly. Sebastian looked uncomfortable. "I did not intend to be noticed." "Then you should have chosen a less obvious carriage," he sighed. "Because I cannot stay away," he admitted quietly. The words hung in the air. Vivienne felt her pulse quicken. "You could simply call on me," she said. "I cannot." "Why?" "Because I am the executor of your uncle's will. And any interest I show might be considered influence." The truth settled between them. "You care for me," Vivienne said slowly. Sebastian closed his eyes briefly. "For 5 years." Her breath caught. He explained how he had first seen her at a scientific lecture years earlier, how her question had impressed him, how he had told her uncle about her brilliance, and how Edmund had noticed the silent admiration growing between them. "He created this situation deliberately," Sebastian said. "He trapped us both." Vivienne felt the world shift beneath her understanding. "You have loved me for 5 years," she whispered. "Yes. Yet you said nothing." "You deserved freedom," he replied. Silence filled the carriage. Outside, the winter wind rattled the branches of bare trees. Finally, Vivienne spoke again. "Mr. Waverley will propose soon." Sebastian's expression tightened. "Will you accept?" Vivienne looked down at her hands. "I do not know." But deep inside, her heart had already begun to answer. And that answer terrified her almost as much as the approaching deadline. Winter settled heavily over London as January turned slowly toward February. The deadline written into Lord Edmund Carter's will loomed closer with each passing day. Vivienne felt it everywhere she went. At dinners, matrons whispered behind their fans. At balls, young men watched her with calculating interest. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same unspoken question. Would she marry before March? Philip Waverley continued calling faithfully 3 times a week. He arrived with flowers, books of poetry, and carefully chosen compliments. He spoke with warmth about companionship and mutual respect. He praised her intelligence and her independence. He described a future where they might share quiet evenings, discussing literature and politics. On the surface, he appeared to be exactly the kind of man she should want. Yet something inside her remained strangely quiet. There was no excitement when he arrived, no quickening of her heart when he smiled, only a polite sense of obligation, and increasingly, a growing awareness of small details she had once overlooked. The cost of the flowers he brought seemed too great for a modest solicitor. His clothing was perfectly polished, yet the cuffs showed signs of wear. Whenever conversation turned toward her inheritance, his attention sharpened noticeably. Vivienne began remembering Lord York's warnings. At the same time, Sebastian Montgomery remained distant. He did not appear at social gatherings. He did not visit her cottage, but his letters continued. Every week, without fail. Letters discussing Willowmere Estate. Questions about improvements for tenant farmers. Suggestions for expanding the botanical gardens. Careful discussions about planting cycles and soil management. Each letter treated her as an equal partner in the future of the estate. Each letter made her miss him more than she wished to admit. Then, one cold afternoon in February, Philip Waverley asked her to walk with him in a nearby park. The trees stood bare against a gray sky. Wind rustled through dry leaves along the path. After a few minutes of conversation, he stopped beneath a tall oak tree and took her hands. "Miss Carter," he said earnestly, "these past months have been the happiest of my life." Vivienne already knew what was coming. "I admire your intelligence and your strength of character," he continued, "and I believe we would make excellent partners." His voice grew more serious. "Given the circumstances of your inheritance, it would perhaps be wise for us to settle your future quickly." There it was, the deadline, the inheritance, the careful phrasing of a man who believed himself clever. "Vivienne," he said, tightening his grip on her hands, "will you marry me?" For a moment she simply looked at him. The words were right. The tone was sincere. The proposal was exactly what society expected her to accept. Yet inside her heart remained quiet. There was no warmth, no excitement, only sadness. "You are very kind," she said gently, "and I am grateful for your affection." Hope brightened his expression, but she continued, "I cannot accept." The smile disappeared instantly. "Affection can grow," he insisted. "Many marriages begin with friendship and develop into love over time." Vivienne shook her head softly. "I need more than that." His expression hardened. "You have only a month remaining before the deadline. Do you truly believe another suitor will appear in time?" "Perhaps not," she said calmly. "But I would rather lose the inheritance than marry without love." The word struck him like a blow. For a moment, anger flashed across his face. "So that is your decision," he said coldly. "You reject a sensible offer because you expect some romantic fantasy." "I expect honesty," Vivienne replied. "You accuse me of fortune hunting," he snapped. "I accuse you of seeing me as a solution rather than a person." Without another word, she turned and walked away. The cold wind followed her down the path, yet for the first time in months, she felt strangely light. When she reached her cottage, she noticed a familiar carriage waiting outside. Lord York stood on the doorstep, speaking quietly with Mrs. Dawson. He turned as she approached. Relief softened his expression immediately. "Miss Carter," he said, "I came because I discovered something important regarding Mr. Waverley." "I already know," Vivienne said calmly. They entered the drawing room together. Sebastian placed several documents on the table. "My solicitor investigated him," he explained. "He is deeply in debt. Gambling losses totaling nearly £4,000. Vivienne studied the papers briefly. "I believe it," she said quietly. "You deserve to be angry," Sebastian said. Instead, she moved to the window. "I am simply tired," she admitted. "Tired of being seen as a fortune instead of a person." Sebastian stepped closer. "You are not invisible to me," he said softly. She turned toward him. "Because of my uncle's will?" "No," he replied firmly. "Because 5 years ago, I saw you challenge an entire room of scholars with a single brilliant question." He stepped closer still. "I have watched you ever since." Vivienne felt tears gathering in her eyes. "That sounds suspiciously like pity." The words clearly hurt him. Pity, he repeated. Yes, she said carefully. You are a good man. You see someone struggling, and you wish to help. For a long moment he stared at her. Then suddenly he closed the distance between them and gently held her face in his hands. Then let me be perfectly clear, he said. I have loved you for 5 years. The room seemed to fall silent around them. Every letter, every conversation, every moment I have watched another man speak to you. His voice trembled slightly. Not because of your inheritance, not because of duty, because you are brilliant and brave and beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with money. His thumbs brushed away the tears on her cheeks. Marry me, Vivienne. The words filled the room, not because of the deadline, not because of Willowmere, because I love you. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely breathe. I love you too, she whispered. The truth felt both terrifying and wonderful. I have loved you through every letter about drainage and tenant cottages, she admitted. Sebastian's expression broke into a rare smile. Then marry me. Yes, she said softly. Their wedding took place on the 15th of March, 1819. The ceremony was small and simple at the church near Willowmere Estate. Vivienne wore an ivory gown with lace sleeves. Sebastian stood at the altar, watching her with open joy. The Court of Chancery had already confirmed that their marriage was genuine and free of coercion. The inheritance remained hers. But by then, the inheritance mattered far less than the man waiting beside her. 5 years later, Willowmere Estate had transformed completely. The gardens flourished under careful care. The tenant cottages had been rebuilt and improved. Vivienne published respected essays on agricultural innovation and botanical science under her own name. Their home filled with laughter. 3 children played in the gardens once collected by her uncle. One quiet evening, Vivienne and Sebastian walked together among the botanical specimens Edmund Carter had once gathered across Europe. He was right, Vivienne said softly. About what? Sebastian asked. About the difference between surviving and truly living. Sebastian took her hand. Then we chose correctly. They stood together beneath the fading sunset. Once she had been called unmarriageable. But the truth had been much simpler. She had only been waiting for a love worth choosing.